Great, thanks for having me here. I just defended recently, so this really is hot off the press, and I'm always glad to have the opportunity to bludgeon a captive audience with data. So my thesis project is motivated by the observation that public opinion is often offside the opinions of communities of experts, whether they be doctors, scientists, or economists, on a wide range of areas of issues that are important for public policy. And I want to answer, well, why is that the case? And by far the dominant explanation for this is that certain citizens are motivated to resist the messages of experts that fly against their ideology or their values. This is known as motivated skepticism. So for example, conservatives may resist messages of climate scientists because acknowledging climate change means acknowledging the need for more government intervention and higher taxes. My dissertation examines three other possible limitations of expert influence on public opinion. The first is that the media may just do a really bad job at communicating this information to the public. And there's lots of theoretical reasons to expect this is the case. For one, journalists tend to frame news about politics in episodic terms. That means they talk about events, they talk about personalities, and they don't really talk about themes and structural issues and the context necessary to be informed about public policy. And so there might not be a lot of room to talk about expert consensus when this media bias is present. Another theme that's been picked up on by climate communication scholars is the problem of false balance, that journalists try to be balanced in their coverage of different political issues, and so when they're citing a climate scientist, they may be inclined to cite a pseudo-expert or a contrarian scientist to balance that perspective. And some experiments have shown this confuses the public about the state of scientific consensus when it exists. And relatedly, journalists like to cover politics in conflict. News readers are attracted to that. It generates clicks for them. And so they'll cite polarizing sources of information like political parties, advocacy groups, interest groups that might prime citizens to resist messages from experts, even if they support or oppose the expert community. So I'm interested in news content and how they cover expert consensus. So I downloaded close to 300,000 news articles on 10 issues where that features some element of expert consensus. I chose some issues that were based in the natural sciences, others that are based in economics, and I chose issues based on their partisan or ideological implications as well. So for example, one issue where liberals tend to resist scientific consensus is on the safety of genetically modified organisms, and conservatives do the same for climate science. I used automated content analysis to identify stories that have relevant content for the expert consensus at hand, and whether or not they have reference to an expert in the text of the article. But unfortunately, automated approaches didn't really get me what I wanted in terms of telling us what experts are saying in news content and what sources are being used to support and oppose their claims. So I manually coded over 3,000 newspaper articles, a lot of newspaper articles, in ways that relate to my research questions. So I coded these articles for whether there was a message in the news by an expert related to narrative consensus, whether there was a clear cue from a journalist signaling that it wasn't just one expert's opinion, but a broader community of experts, whether or not there was false balance or contrarian scientists, and whether or not there were polarizing allies or opponents of the expert community in the text of the newspaper articles. By far, the biggest takeaway finding is that messages about expert consensus are very rare, even in relevant coverage that is directly relevant to that consensus. So only 22% of these stories that had content relevant to expert consensus actually featured a message from an expert related to that consensus. And only in 2% of cases was there actually a clear signal that this was actually a consensus or widespread opinion in the expert community. This varies across issues, and this is shown on the screen here. On the left, you see the most frequent use of expert messages, so vaccines, climate change coverage, not that surprising, but the story gets bleaker as you move to the right of the graph. But even still, in light blue, which is not showing that clearly there, the consensus cues, even for vaccines and climate change coverage, not that common. This isn't a very common journalistic practice. And if anything, this overstates the case. This is content relevant to the expert consensus, but not all the stories that I downloaded had actual content relevant to that consensus. So for example, on immigration, on the economics of immigration, not all stories about immigration talked about the economic benefits or costs of immigration. So when these results are presented as a share of total news coverage on these issues, the story is much, much bleaker. On the other hand, false balance isn't as common as you might expect. Only 22% of stories contain some element of citing contrary experts or scientists. This is most common in GMO and nuclear power coverage, but is not all that common across the board on my other issues. Comparatively, it is much more common for journalists to cite polarizing opponents, so parties and interest groups that oppose the expert position. This was done 42% of the time. And polarizing allies were cited 48% of the time as well. And this is more common in economic issues like farm support and the Federal Reserve, but it's still pretty common on most of the science issues that I looked at. The only exceptions is vaccines, which is very depoliticized in news coverage. Climate change is a bit of an anomaly where a lot of polarizing allies are cited, like the Democratic Party, but not a lot of polarizing opponents. So the news media does not do a very good job covering expert consensus. It's not very common. It's clouded in politicization. But on the other hand, climate change is a bit better than the other issues in terms of how it's covered. But nonetheless, we know that Americans and Canadians to some degree are polarized on their attitudes towards climate change along partisan or ideological lines. And why is that the case? And this leads me to my second problem that I identify in this thesis, that of political party elites. We make the argument in this paper that citizens, partisan citizens in particular, learned the positions they wanted to take on climate change from cues or messages sent by party elites communicated through the mass media. And this is consistent with a wide range of literature in public opinion formation and political science. And we make a distinction here between in-group and out-group queuing. In-group queuing is where you follow your own party's leader, and out-group queuing is where you're repelled by leaders of the opposing party. We asked in this paper, are party elite messages in the news media correlated with aggregate levels of climate skepticism after we control for a bunch of other factors that we think are important based on academic literature? So to do this, we construct an automated content analysis of over 25,000 climate change news stories from a wide range of sources. We measure party cues with a dictionary of keywords and phrases, and this allows us to identify articles that have references to party elites in the content. And about 80% of these references actually signal a stance on climate change, so most of these are pretty valid. This graph here shows the increase in party cues over time. The dashed black line is the total number of party cues, so rising to over 50% of news content on climate change. And this is driven in particular by democratic elites. We measure public opinion on climate change, climate skepticism in particular, with an aggregate measure based on 172 publicly available polls going all the way back to 1986. We construct an annual measure of climate skepticism, that's shown on the left, starting in '86, and we use a quarterly measure starting in 2001. And as you can see, climate skepticism, skepticism towards the science of climate change, has gone up over time. But unfortunately, those measures aren't broken down by party. So we supplement those measures with the Partisan Climate Change Threat Index from Carmichael and Brule. It's quarterly as well. It starts in 2001, but it's broken down by Democratic and Republican parties. And in this measure, it's the perceptions of climate change threat felt by each party's respondents. So Democrats are in blue, Republicans are in red. You see the gulf that exists between the two. On the right is the polarization between these two measures. And so since 2001, polarization in the American public has approximately doubled. So we estimate a series of models that predict these changes in aggregate climate skepticism and attitudes towards climate threat. And we find that our most consistent predictor are messages from Democratic Party elites. They predict attitudes towards climate skepticism, Republican attitudes towards climate threat, and overall polarization. And together it suggests that there is an out-group queuing effect going on for Republican identifiers. They are being repelled by the signals sent by Democratic elites. There's also some inconsistent evidence that Republican Party identifiers are supporting their own party as well. To get an even clearer causal story of this, this is all correlational. We wanted to run an experiment as well. So we gathered a survey of almost 3,000 Americans. We randomly assigned them party messages from either the Democratic Party in favor of climate change mitigation or the Republican Party opposed to climate change mitigation to see what causal effect that has on attitudes towards climate skepticism. So the horizontal red bar is no effect at all. As you go above that bar, people are becoming more skeptical about climate science. As you move to the right, those are Republicans. And so you see, when exposed to these cues from party elites, whether Republican or Democrat, Republicans become more skeptical about climate change. But for Democrats, there is no effect. So there's some evidence of asymmetry. Party elites mattered. Now, climate change is a quintessential example of an issue that's very ideologically charged, but on a lot of other issues of expert consensus, that's not the case. And so that leads me to the third problem I identify in my thesis, that of anti-intellectualism. Some people might just be skeptical about experts and expert advice. And surprisingly, this concept hasn't received a lot of attention. I treat it here as a fundamental or generalized mistrust of experts and intellectuals resulting from a disdain of scholarly and intellectual pursuits. And the implication is pretty straightforward. To the extent that trust is required for persuasion, those that have anti-intellectual views should be less persuaded by expert consensus when it exists than those that are more trusting of experts. To test this hypothesis and a bunch of others in this paper, I gathered a sample from Amazon Mechanical Turk, about 3,600 Americans. I measure anti-intellectualism with a battery of trust questions related to trust in different communities of experts, not just scientists, but economists and lawyers and lots of others as well. And I construct a 0 to 1 index that I show on the screen here. Past 0.5 is where you become very highly anti-intellectual. That applies to about only 20% of Americans, but that's still a sizable number. We should be concerned about that. I chose 4 issues with some strong scientific consensus and evaluated the extent to which respondents supported each of these positions. They were overwhelmingly on side with climate change, Republicans aside, but much more mixed in their opinions about the other 3 issues that I selected. And here's where the experiment comes in. I randomly assigned people into 2 groups. In one group, they just gave me their opinions on these 4 issues. In another group, beforehand, they were told that there was a scientific consensus that existed on each of these issues. And so I expect the persuasiveness of that message, that cue, to be weaker among people that are more anti-intellectual. And that is what I find. The results are shown on the screen. So again, the horizontal red bar is no effect. If you're above the bar, you're becoming more supportive of the scientific consensus. If you're below the bar, you're becoming less supportive. And on 3 of the 4 issues, this result holds. All things considered, if you are most trusting of experts, you will be persuaded by expert consensus. But that persuasiveness declines as anti-intellectualism rises, such that people that are the most anti-intellectual actually double down in their opposition to support of expert positions. So they become even less supportive. And that was found on all 4 of my issues. So taken together, the analyses in my dissertation highlight the need for scholars to take the information environment seriously. For starters, we can't simply assume that citizens are exposed to information from experts. We put a lot on the average citizen. We expect them to be informed about things, but the media doesn't do a good job of doing that. My findings show that signals from expert consensus are exceedingly rare in the media environment, even on high-profile issues like climate change, and even in news content that is directly relevant to that consensus. And so that should be a wake-up call for both experts and journalists. For experts, we need to do a better job assembling consensus documents to guide journalists in their coverage of these issues. It is very hard to find this information, and journalists are pressed for time and need a little bit of assistance. Journalists, for their part, need to do due diligence when they're communicating positions from experts. Is this the opinion of one expert, or is this the opinion of the broader expert community? They need to do due diligence. And we need to account for the fact that signals from experts are often communicated to citizens in a polarizing context. Vaccines are an exception to this, But on all the other issues that I studied, this is a staple of news content, and it might block the persuasiveness of experts among highly motivated citizens. But it's not clear what, if anything, we should do about this. Areas of expert consensus have a lot of relevance for certain economic and social groups, and these voices deserve to be heard in news coverage. But nonetheless, journalists should carefully evaluate whether it's necessary to carry these sources of information when also communicating positions of expert consensus. Need to exercise more caution. These findings also show us the limits of ideology-driven motivated reasoning. It's just too static. When we think of motivated reasoning, motivated skepticism, we tend to imagine people are locked into their beliefs and their values. But our analyses show that cues from party elites are strongly associated with climate skepticism over time, and our experiment shows the same too. Republican hostility towards climate science was not necessarily a foregone conclusion, and party elites may have a role in depolarizing Americans as well. We can't just simply assume patterns of opinion that we see today are locked in and a fait accompli. People move their opinions and attitudes in response to trusted sources of communication. And finally, these results suggest we need to be skeptical and cautious about grand ideas of persuasion. So science communicators have kind of latched on to consensus cues as a way to break through ideology-driven motivated reasoning. And I think these cues are important and might persuade a lot of people that consensus exists and they should move their opinions accordingly. But nonetheless, we know that consensus cues may potentially backfire among a sizable portion of the public. And so we have to be cautious about unintended consequences of certain persuasive strategies. Find ways of breaking through them as well, and that should be an agenda for future research. That's it. Thank you very much.